On the eve of his hanging, when the town of Red Hollow lay hushed beneath a moon bleached thin as bone, Caleb Rourke sat alone in the narrow room beneath the gallows, the smell of old rope and damp wood pressing in on him like a second sentence, and as the wind slipped through the cracks it carried with it the low creak of the scaffold above, a patient, waiting sound that matched the slow beating of his heart, for this was the last night the law had given him, one final mercy before morning. Claimed his breath, and though men had called him butcher, devil, and curse upon the frontier, no one had asked him who he truly was, not the sheriff who read the charges with shaking hands, not the crowd that would gather at dawn hungry for an ending, and certainly not the world that had shaped him into something sharp and feared, and so with no priest present and no witness but the dark itself, Caleb began to speak, at first barely louder than the wind, confessing not to God as he had been told to do, but to the land, to the past, to the ghosts that sat with him in that room, for there was a truth buried deeper than the shallow graves that followed his name, truth that had never fit the legend of the outlaw who rode hard and left blood in his tracks, and it began many years before Red Hollow knew to fear him, back when his hands were clean and his voice had not yet learned how to threaten, back when he believed a man could live honest if he worked hard enough and loved something fiercely enough, and as he spoke his voice grew steadier, shaped by memory, by regret, by a tenderness no one would have believed belonged to him, for he spoke of a woman named Eliza Moore, a schoolteacher with ink-stained fingers and a quiet laugh who arrived in the territory carrying more hope than possessions, who looked at Caleb not as a drifter or a gun hand but as a man worth listening to, and in her presence he learned what it felt like to be seen without suspicion, to be wanted without fear, and he confessed how love had softened him, how he had planned to leave the wandering life behind, how the two of them had dreamed of a small place near the river where the nights were quiet and the future felt possible, but the Wild West was not a land that forgave gentle plans. And when a powerful cattle baron set his sights on Eliza and she refused him, it was Caleb who stood in the way, Caleb who took the blame when men with badges burned down the schoolhouse and called it justice, Caleb who was hunted not because he was guilty but because he would not bow, and as he spoke the rope above him groaned again as if listening, as if the gallows itself wished to know why the man beneath it had earned such a bloody reputation, and Caleb confessed that the first life he took had not been in rage but in defense, that his hands shook afterward, that he vomited behind a mesquite tree and cried for a woman who believed words could change men who had never learned to listen. And yet that single moment had marked him, had taught the world what to expect from him, and so he learned to become what they already believed him to be, an outlaw shaped not by cruelty but by survival, by grief, by a love he could not save, and as the night deepened he spoke of how Eliza died not in his arms as legends might claim but alone, sick and hidden, because anyone tied to his name became a target, and how the knowledge of that truth had hollowed him out, leaving behind a man who rode without destination, who robbed not for wealth but to wound the system that had crushed her, who shot not for pleasure but to keep breathing one more day in a world that no longer held joy, and the confession grew darker then, more intimate, as he admitted that every crime pinned to his name carried a piece of that loss, that every wanted poster erased the parts of him that had once loved quietly, and yet still, even now, with death waiting just beyond the door, he did not beg for mercy. Because what he wanted most was not life but understanding, the hope that somewhere, someday, someone might know that the legend was a lie sharpened by fear, that the blood-soaked stories hid a man who had tried, and failed, to choose a different ending, and as the wind howled harder through the gallows and footsteps passed in the distance, guards changing shifts, unaware that history was being rewritten in whispers, Caleb lowered his voice and confessed the secret no one had ever known, that the final robbery, the one that sealed his fate, had not been for gold at all but for a bundle of letters locked away by the cattle baron's family, letters written by Eliza in her final weeks, letters that proved the fire and her death had been ordered, letters he had hoped to deliver to the world so her name would be cleared even if his never could be, and though he failed, though the law caught him before the truth could breathe, he spoke those words into the darkness now as an offering, as a quiet rebellion against the rope, and when at last his voice gave out and silence reclaimed the room, the gallows above him stilled, the wind softened, and for the first time in years Caleb Rourke felt something close to peace, unaware that somewhere beyond the jail walls, those whispered truths were already beginning to move, carried by the same restless wind that had once turned an honest man into an outlaw and might, by morning, turn a condemned legend into something far more dangerous. A question. When Marianne Calder arrived in Red Mesa, she came the way dust storms do, quiet at first, almost unnoticed, until every man in town felt the change in the air and could not say why, for she rode alone in a dark dress faded by sun and loss, her face pale but steady, her eyes holding a calm that unsettled people more than anger ever could, and within days her name began to move through saloons and stores like a warning whispered too late. The widow of Red Mesa, they called her, a woman followed by death, a woman whose husbands and lovers, outlaws, gunslingers, men with blood on their hands and hope still flickering somewhere inside, had all met violent ends, some by rope, some by bullet, some by betrayal, and whether the stories were true or sharpened by fear hardly mattered, because men lowered their voices when she passed and turned away not out of cruelty but self-preservation, as if loving her were a wager against fate itself, and Marianne learned quickly to keep her gaze forward and her heart guarded, renting a small adobe house at the edge of town where the desert stretched wide and unforgiving, a place where grief felt familiar and silence did not judge, for she had buried love before and knew how easily attachment turned into regret, and yet despite her careful distance the land seemed intent on testing her resolve, because one evening as the sun bled red across the mesas and the heat clung stubbornly to the air, a man collapsed at her doorstep, his body striking the dirt with a dull sound that echoed louder in her chest than in the empty street, and when she opened the door she saw blood darkening his shirt, saw a face worn by violence and exhaustion, saw a stranger who looked like every mistake she had sworn never to repeat, and still, without pausing to ask his name or the reason he was wounded, she dragged him inside, because whatever curse men claimed followed her, she had never turned away someone dying, and as she worked through the night cleaning the wound and pressing cloth to torn flesh, she learned his name was Elias Crow, that he spoke little and watched her with guarded eyes, that pain sharpened his breathing but did not break his pride, and as the hours passed something old and dangerous stirred between them, not desire yet, but recognition, the kind that comes when two people know loss well enough to read it in another's silence, and in the days that followed Red Mesa watched with a mix of fascination and dread as the wounded gunslinger remained alive, as smoke rose each morning from the widow's chimney, as Elias slowly healed beneath her roof instead of dying as men expected him to, and rumors bloomed like desert weeds after rain, that she was tempting fate again, that the curse had simply not collected its due yet, that Elias Crow would bleed out or be hunted down before the month was done, and Marianne heard every whisper but said nothing, because she had learned long ago that defending herself only fed the stories, and instead she focused on the small, human moments, the way Elias flinched at sudden sounds, the way he stared too long at the horizon as if expecting it to rise up and strike him, the way his voice softened when he spoke of nothing at all, and slowly, against her will, her heart began to remember how it felt to care, to wait for footsteps, to fear loss before it happened, and this frightened her more than the town ever could, for she believed the stories herself in quiet moments, believed that something about her love led men toward violence, that her presence drew danger like heat draws lightning. And she told Elias one night as they sat on opposite sides of the small table, lamplight trembling between them, that he should leave as soon as he was able, that staying would only bring trouble, and he listened without interrupting, then said simply that trouble had found him long before her door ever did, and in that answer she heard the truth of a man who had never expected peace and therefore did not fear losing it, and still she resisted what grew between them, even as days stretched into weeks and Elias began helping around the house, fixing a broken hinge, carrying water, moving with care as if aware that every gesture was slowly binding them together, and when he smiled, rarely, but honestly, it felt like something fragile being offered rather than taken, and the desert seemed to watch them, the sun bearing down with quiet indifference as fate tightened its slow, patient grip, because Red Mesa was not a place where past stayed buried, and Elias's past arrived one afternoon in the form of men on horseback, hard-eyed and armed, asking questions too politely, and Marianne knew then that whatever curse the town believed in was not magic at all but consequence, a pattern of violence that followed men like Elias and swept up anyone foolish enough to stand near them, and that night she told him to go, truly this time, her voice breaking not from fear but from care, because loving him felt like stepping beneath a loaded sky, and Elias stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, torn between gratitude and longing, and when he reached out to touch her cheek he stopped himself halfway, as if afraid even that small tenderness might cost them both, and he left before dawn, riding out into the pale morning without looking back, and for a time Marianne believed she had escaped the worst of it, that heartbreak was a smaller price than bloodshed, but fate is rarely satisfied with restraint, and days later gunfire cracked across the edge of town, sharp and final, and by the time word reached her door the story had already taken shape. Elias Crow, shot dead while defending himself from men who would not let him leave his past behind, another outlaw dead, another name added to the widow's legend, and Marianne did not scream or collapse when she heard it. She simply sat very still as if holding herself together by will alone, because grief had taught her how to endure without spectacle, and that night she walked beyond the town lights and stood beneath the vast, uncaring stars, mourning not just Elias but the life they never dared to imagine, the love that remained unspoken out of fear. And yet as the wind moved across the sand she felt something shift, a quiet understanding that tragedy did not mean meaninglessness, that even brief connection left a mark deeper than rumor or fear. And though Red Mesa would continue to whisper her name with dread, Marianne Calder carried within her the truth the town would never know, that love, however short and dangerous, had been real, and that fate might wound her again, but it would never convince her that compassion was a mistake. Even under the burning western sun, Deadwood Crossing had forgotten what law looked like long before Jonah Hale rode in beneath a sky the color of old iron. The town crouched low and weary between dry hills like an animal that had learned to endure pain rather than fight it, for the sheriff's office had stood empty for years, its star-shaped badge rusting on a hook as a reminder of promises broken and men buried. And when Jonah's horse stepped onto the main street, people paused not out of hope but suspicion, because hope had cost them dearly before. And the man who dismounted looked no savior at first glance, his shoulders slumped, his coat worn thin, his face marked by years of dust and regret, and yet when he stepped onto the boardwalk there was something in the way he moved that stirred old memories, a steadiness beneath the weariness. And when he pushed open the door to the abandoned office and lifted the badge from its hook, the sound of metal against wood echoed louder than a gunshot in that silent room, for Jonah Hale had once sworn he would never touch a badge again, not after the day it failed him. Not after the day his choices had led to blood on the street and names carved into crude wooden markers. And as he sat alone in the dim office with the badge heavy in his palm, he remembered another town, another crossing, where he had been younger and certain that doing the right thing was enough, where he had trusted men who smiled too easily and underestimated men who spoke little, and where a gang had ridden in under cover of night while he hesitated, waiting for backup that never came. And by dawn the jail was burned, the townsfolk broken, and the woman he loved gone forever, taken by the violence he had sworn to stop. And that memory followed him now like a shadow that no amount of distance could shake, because Jonah had not ridden to Deadwood Crossing seeking redemption, only rest, a place to lay down his past and disappear into anonymity. But the land had other plans, and within hours word spread that a marshal was back, that a badge had found a chest willing to carry it, and men who had grown rich on fear took notice, because Deadwood Crossing was controlled by Silas Crowder, a man who ruled through hired guns and quiet threats, who let the town rot just enough to keep it dependent. And when Crowder heard that a lone marshal had arrived, he laughed, sending a message carried by men with hard eyes and soft voices, offering Jonah a chance to leave before trouble followed him. And Jonah listened without interruption, then replied that he was tired of leaving, tired of letting fear decide the shape of towns and lives. And though his voice did not rise, something in it carried weight, the sound of a man who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to bargain with. And so Deadwood Crossing began to change in small, dangerous ways, with Jonah reopening the jail, fixing doors, standing in the street at dawn and dusk like a quiet challenge, and the townsfolk watched from windows and doorways, unsure whether to step forward or keep their distance, because courage was contagious but so was fear. And Jonah did not ask for loyalty or praise, he simply did the work, breaking up fights, disarming drunks, walking the streets at night despite the ache in his bones and the memories that surfaced in the dark. And as days passed, people began to speak to him, first cautiously, then with growing trust, telling him where Crowder's men hid, which families had been threatened, how long they had waited for someone to stand. And Jonah listened, knowing that information alone would not be enough when Crowder decided to test him. And that test came sooner than expected, when a body was found at the edge of town, a warning wrapped in violence. And the message was clear: leave or the town would pay. And Jonah stood over the body long after others turned away, the past pressing in on him until he could hear another woman's voice from another time asking why he had waited, why he had believed things would work out without blood. And this time he did not wait, calling the townsfolk together in the square, telling them the truth without promise or comfort, that Crowder would not stop, that violence was coming whether they wanted it or not, and that standing together was the only chance they had. And as he spoke he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on him again, the knowledge that if he failed these people would suffer as others once had because of him. And that night as he sat alone cleaning his revolver, hands steady despite the tremor in his chest, he admitted to himself that fear had never truly left him, That bravery was not the absence of it but the decision to act regardless, and when Crowder's men rode in at dawn the next day, guns drawn and numbers heavy, Deadwood Crossing held its breath, because Jonah walked out alone to meet them, dust swirling around his boots, the badge catching the light like a challenge, and words were exchanged that meant nothing because both sides knew the truth, and when the first shot rang out the town erupted, windows shattering, people running, men shouting, and Jonah moved through the chaos with a grim focus born of hard lessons learned too late in another life, directing townsfolk to safety, taking cover where needed, firing only when necessary, and the fight was brutal and uneven, Crowder's men ruthless and practiced, but they had not expected resistance, had not expected a town long beaten to rise behind a single broken marshal, and when it ended the street was scarred, the air thick with smoke and pain, and Crowder himself lay wounded and captured. His rule ended not by Jonah's gun alone but by the combined courage of people who had finally believed change was possible, and as silence settled Jonah stood amid the wreckage feeling neither triumph nor relief, only a heavy, quiet exhaustion, because victory did not erase the past or return what had been lost, and later, as the town tended its wounded and the sun dipped low, Jonah returned the badge to his chest not with pride but acceptance, understanding now that he could never undo his failure, only choose differently when the chance returned, and Deadwood Crossing, scarred but standing, began the slow work of becoming something more than a place defined by fear, while Jonah Hale, the last marshal of a forgotten town, faced the ghosts that had ridden with him all these years and found that though they never truly left, they no longer held the reins. Black Canyon earned its name long before men tried to carve wealth from its stone, a place where sunlight seemed to die before reaching the canyon floor and the wind moved with a low, uneasy voice that never fully quieted, and it was into this land that Ethan Cole rode with desperation pressing harder against his ribs than hunger or thirst, for he carried in his still bag a weathered map inked in a trembling hand, a thing passed to him by a dying prospector who swore the canyon hid a vein of gold so rich it could buy a man out of every mistake he had ever made, and Ethan, who had lost his farm to drought, his wife to illness, and his faith to the slow cruelty of the frontier, believed there was nothing left for him to lose. Yet even on the first night beneath the open sky he sensed something was wrong, because as the fire burned low he heard whispers threading through the wind, voices too close and too knowing, calling his name with a familiarity that made his skin prickle, promising relief, promising answers, promising an end to want, and though he told himself it was only the desert playing tricks on a tired mind, he slept poorly and dreamed of hands reaching up from stone, of gold veins pulsing like living things beneath the earth, and when he woke the canyon loomed closer, darker, as if it had shifted during the night to meet him halfway, and as he rode deeper the whispers followed, sometimes soft as prayer, sometimes sharp as accusation, reminding him of debts unpaid and promises broken, of the way he had begged his wife to hold on when her strength was gone, of the prayer he never finished when she died before dawn, and the land seemed to listen to those memories, to feed on them, because Black Canyon was not empty but old, layered with suffering left behind by men who came seeking fortune and found only ruin, and as Ethan followed the map through narrow passes and along ledges that dropped away into nothing, he began to notice signs of those who had failed before him, rusted tools half buried in rock, scraps of clothing snagged on thorny brush, a single boot with the leather worn smooth by walking in circles, and with each discovery the whispers grew clearer, less like wind and more like voices gathered just beyond sight, urging him onward, telling him he was close now, closer than any before him, and when at last he reached the place marked on the map, a narrow fissure splitting the canyon wall like a wound that never healed, he felt a rush of triumph and dread in equal measure, because the stone there shimmered faintly even in shadow, threads of yellow glinting beneath layers of black rock. Unmistakable, undeniable, and as his fingers brushed the surface the whispers fell silent all at once, replaced by a heavy stillness that pressed in on his ears, and in that silence a single voice rose, low and calm, speaking not aloud but directly into his thoughts, telling him that the gold was his for the taking, that it had waited a long time for a man honest enough to admit his greed, but that every gift carried a balance, and as Ethan stood frozen with his hand against the rock he felt the canyon itself watching him, waiting for his answer, and he told himself he did not believe in devils or curses, only in hard work and chance, and yet when he struck the rock with his pick the sound echoed unnaturally, ringing long after the blow ended, and the whispers returned in a rush, filling the narrow space with murmured approval, and for hours he worked feverishly, tearing free chunks of gold-veined stone, sweat stinging his eyes, exhaustion forgotten in the face of sudden wealth. And when he finally stepped back, breath ragged, his sack heavy with awe, he laughed aloud, the sound sharp and wild against the canyon walls, but his laughter faltered when he saw footprints in the dust behind him that were not his own, leading deeper into the shadows, and as night fell the canyon seemed to close in, the stars above dimmed by clouds that rolled in without warning, and the whispers grew insistent, no longer promising but demanding, telling him the price was due, telling him he could not leave without paying what was owed, and when he tried to sleep he saw shapes moving just beyond the firelight, felt fingers brush his boots, heard his wife's voice calling his name not with anger but with sorrow, asking him why he had come to such a place, and by morning Ethan was no longer certain how many days he had been in the canyon or how much time had passed since he first struck gold, because the canyon bent time as easily as it bent sound, and when he tried to retrace his path the map no longer made sense, its lines shifting, its landmarks unrecognizable, and panic began to claw at him, feeding the whispers until they rose to a chorus that filled his head, offering guidance in exchange for obedience, and when he followed those voices they led him to more gold, always more, veins richer than the last, until his sack grew too heavy to lift and his hands shook from exhaustion, and with every step he felt weaker, thinner, as if something were being drawn out of him. With each piece of gold he claimed, and at last he understood the truth of the curse, that the canyon did not demand blood or souls in some sudden bargain but took its payment slowly, quietly, by eroding the will to leave, by convincing men that one more strike, one more vein, would be enough, and when Ethan finally tried to flee, dropping his sack and running blindly through the dark, the canyon resisted, paths narrowing, walls shifting, whispers turning cruel, reminding him that he had chosen this, that he had asked for escape without cost, and in a moment of clarity born of terror he shouted into the darkness that he would leave the gold, that he wanted nothing from the canyon, and the voices laughed, not loudly but with a patient certainty, telling him it was too late, that the gold he had taken had already marked him, and as dawn broke faintly over the canyon rim Ethan collapsed near the fissure where it had all begun, his body spent, his eyes hollow, and there he remained, breathing shallowly, until the sun climbed higher and the whispers softened again, coaxing, comforting, promising rest, and whether he died there or wandered deeper into the stone was never known, because Black Canyon does not return what it claims, but weeks later a trader passing near the canyon's edge found a map pinned beneath a stone, the ink fresh despite the age of the paper, the markings clear and inviting, and when the trader lifted it he swore he heard a voice on the wind, gentle and persuasive, telling him that fortune lay just beyond the next ridge, and so the legend of the Devil's Gold endured. Not as a tale meant to frighten men away, but as a whisper carried across the desert, waiting for the desperate, the grieving, and the hopeful, for Black Canyon did not hunt its victims, it waited, knowing that sooner or later, someone would always listen.